Millionaire buys coffee for an elderly homeless woman, and then she shows him a picture that changes their lives. It was 9 a.m. when Lucas left the meeting in the gleaming glass corporate building. The soft morning light reflected off the surrounding skyscrapers, creating an interesting contrast with the long shadows stretching across the streets. As always, he looked impeccable. His perfectly tailored Italian suit, meticulously polished shoes, and the gold watch on his wrist made him the picture of a man who was in control. Lucas was known in all business circles as someone who always got what he wanted. Ambitious, cold, and calculating, qualities that had led him to build an enviable financial empire before he even turned 40. But behind that facade of success, there was something he rarely admitted, not even to himself. A constant emptiness that had been with him for years. A silent void that no fortune, luxury car, or penthouse with an ocean view seemed to fill. Lately, that feeling had been growing, but as always, Lucas drowned it out with more work, more meetings, more million-dollar acquisitions. He had just left the luxurious coffee shop where he had his morning coffee, almost a sacred ritual for him. The staff at the counter already knew his order, and the fine porcelain cup with a double latte was always ready, waiting for him. As he headed to his car, something unexpected caught his attention. On the sidewalk, almost hidden among the crowd of hurried passers-by, an elderly woman sat cross-legged, her trembling hands resting on her lap. She wore a tattered coat, clearly worn by time, and her white hair was tangled, hanging over her wrinkled face. Lucas normally wouldn't have noticed something like that. He was used to looking away from anything that didn't fit into his flawless world. But for some reason he couldn't explain, his eyes locked on this woman. The contrast between his life of excess and her life of deprivation was a momentary shock, a kind of dissonance he couldn't ignore. Her face had something familiar about it, but he shook his head, thinking it was just a fleeting impression. With determined steps, Lucas continued on his way, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling growing in his chest. "I have a meeting in 20 minutes, he muttered to himself, trying to focus on the busy day ahead. But as he opened his car door, he suddenly stopped. It was an unusual, almost involuntary impulse. He looked back toward the woman, who was now staring at the ground with a distant look. Something inside him, something he didn't recognize, made him turn back. With slow steps, he returned to the coffee shop and ordered another coffee. He didn't know why he was doing it. Maybe it was just a symbolic gesture, an attempt to silence the emptiness inside him, or maybe it was curiosity. He didn't have time for charity. His life was too busy, too important for such trivial gestures. And yet there he was, with an extra coffee in hand, walking back to the woman. "Excuse me," he said, his voice unexpectedly gentle. The woman slowly lifted her head, her tired eyes meeting Lucas. She seemed surprised, as if she wasn't used to being approached like that. "Would you like a coffee?" he offered, unsure of how to continue. Awkwardness filled his gestures for a moment. The woman looked at the cup he was offering, and then back at Lucas. Her gaze was deep, as if she could see beyond the surface, beyond the confident businessman he presented to the world. "I'll take it," she said, her voice raspy but firm. Lucas crouched down, handing her the coffee. She took the cup with trembling hands, and for a moment, there was only silence between them. Lucas felt a growing unease. Something inside him wasn't quite right. Why did this feel so significant? He didn't have time to dwell on such thoughts. He was about to stand up and leave when the woman looked directly into his eyes and said, in a low voice, almost a whisper, "You seem like someone carrying a burden you can't see." Lucas blinked, surprised. The comment pierced through his usual cool demeanor. He let out a nervous laugh, shaking his head. "Me? A burden? I think you've got the wrong guy," he replied, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled in the air. "I'm just being polite." The woman gave a small smile. as if she knew something he didn't. Sometimes, politeness reveals more about us than we realize. Have you ever looked back? Young man? Lucas frowned, confused and slightly uncomfortable. Look back. He shook his head. I don't have time for that. What's in the past stays in the past. The woman held her gaze on him a moment longer than Lucas was prepared to endure. Without another word, she lowered her head, as if she already knew he wasn't ready to hear more. Lucas felt a strange restlessness, as though the conversation was unfinished, even though he couldn't quite figure out what was missing. He stood up quickly, straightening his jacket. Have a good day, he said with a brief nod, turning to walk away. But as he walked off, he couldn't help but glance over his shoulder one last time. There she was, staring at the cup he'd given her, the lines on her face seeming to hold secrets he wasn't ready to uncover. Lucas walked away from the woman, moving quickly, as if he wanted to leave that uncomfortable encounter behind. However, with each step, a strange feeling followed him. It was as if something about that brief interaction felt unfinished, something he didn't quite understand. Lucas's mind was like a well-tuned machine, always focused on concrete and tangible results. But for some reason, that morning, he couldn't concentrate on what came next. The upcoming meeting, the pending million-dollar deal. The woman's face, her tired and mysterious gaze, kept echoing in his memory. He stopped abruptly in the middle of the sidewalk. The busy movement of pedestrians around him felt like a distant distraction. What am I doing? He asked himself, frustrated by his own indecision. He felt an uncontrollable urge to turn back. Something about that woman unsettled him, a feeling he had never experienced before, as if she knew something about him, something he didn't even know himself. With a deep breath, he turned on his heels and walked back to where she had been sitting. The old woman seemed not to have moved. Her gaze was distant, as if her mind wandered to places Lucas could never imagine. When he stopped in front of her again, she slowly lifted her head, her cloudy eyes reflecting a wisdom that deeply disturbed him. I forgot something, he said, without much conviction. He wasn't sure what he expected from this second meeting, but curiosity was eating him up inside. She tilted her head slightly, her thin, cracked lips forming an almost imperceptible smile. Ah, you came back. I didn't think you'd have the courage. Lucas frowned. Courage? I just thought we could talk a little more. He crouched down, sitting on the curb beside her, even though the idea of sitting on the dirty sidewalk was completely against his nature. I don't know why, he added, honestly confused by his own actions. The woman held the coffee he had offered her earlier, still untouched. She looked at the cup, then at Lucas, and finally smiled. Kindness isn't something you see every day, especially from someone like you. There was something about the way she said, someone like you, that made him uncomfortable, as if it were a subtle accusation or a reflection of who he was behind his polished exterior. Someone like me? Lucas raised an eyebrow. What do you mean by that? The woman looked away, toward the flow of hurried people passing by. You're rich, successful, but empty. Her voice, low but steady, wasn't judgmental, just a simple, straightforward observation. I've seen it before. Lucas stepped back, feeling a sudden heat rise in his chest, a mix of anger and confusion. Who was she to say something like that? A beggar, a stranger, judging his life without knowing anything about him. You don't know anything about me, he replied, his voice colder now, trying to regain the composure he was used to. I work hard, I build all of this. Nothing was handed to me for free. She nodded slowly, as if she had expected that response. I know, and that's why you can't see what really matters. Lucas let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. Look, I was just trying to offer you a coffee. I wasn't expecting a moral lesson. I'm not trying to teach you anything, she said calmly. I just wanted you to listen." She paused, her eyes now fixed on him, as if she were trying to see into his soul. "What do you really know about your life, Lucas? Who are you really?" He stiffened at the sound of his name. "How do you know my name?" he asked, his voice now tinged with suspicion. She gave an enigmatic smile, something between sad and compassionate. "There are things you're not ready to know yet, but it was time someone asked you. You're always running, always chasing something that, deep down, you don't understand. Have you ever stopped to think about what you're really searching for?" Lucas clenched his fists. "I know exactly what I'm looking for. Success, stability. I work to make sure I have everything I need. I don't need anything else." "Are you sure?" She leaned in slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "If that were true, why did you come back? Why can't you stop thinking about it? About this emptiness?" He didn't have an answer for that. The unease in his mind turned into a kind of irritation. Lucas was someone who was used to controlling situations, dominating conversations, and manipulating events to his advantage. But here, with this woman, he felt completely off balance. The mystery she exuded bothered him. He didn't know what she wanted or how she knew so much about him. "Did you ever have a family?" she asked, changing the tone suddenly, as if the question was the most natural thing in the world. Lucas blinked, caught off guard by the abrupt change of subject. "Family? I know. I grew up in an orphanage. I never knew my parents." His voice came out lower than he intended, as if it were a secret he rarely admitted. "That's why." The woman sighed, as if a piece of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. "Why what?" Lucas shot back, feeling his stomach twist at the conversation. "What does this have to do with anything? You spend your whole life searching for something you lost before you even had the chance to understand what it was." Her tone wasn't accusing, but filled with a deep and sad understanding. The absence of those who should have protected you, the emptiness of not knowing where you came from. It stays with you, Lucas, and it shapes you, whether you realize it or not. Lucas was about to get up, but her words held him in place, like an emotional anchor he couldn't shake off. He shook his head, trying to push away the strange feeling that was beginning to weigh on his chest. "You don't understand. You can't understand." The woman smiled faintly, a shadow of sadness behind her eyes. "I understand more than you think. Sometimes the past is what gives the present meaning. Running from it won't fill the emptiness." Lucas felt a lump in his throat. He suddenly stood up, unsure of what to say. I need to go." His voice was more hesitant than usual, and he hated that. He said goodbye quickly, before she could say anything else. As he walked away, though, the woman's whisper kept echoing in his mind, like a shadow he couldn't ignore. Sometimes the past is what gives the present meaning. He walked off without looking back, but deep down, he knew that conversation was far from over. Back in his luxurious office, Lucas sat at his glass desk, surrounded by business awards, multi-million-dollar contracts, and windows offering a prime view of the city. It was the kind of environment that usually comforted him, a tangible proof of his achievements, his power. But that morning, the usual calm didn't reach him. The silence was heavy, and the memories of the strange conversation with the old woman swirled around him like stubborn ghosts. He tried to focus on work. There was an important merger to finalize, a call with European investors, and his schedule was packed with crucial meetings. But every time he tried to dive into these matters, his mind drifted back to that sidewalk encounter. The phrase she whispered before he left, "Sometimes the past is what gives the present meaning," felt etched in his mind. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of the phone. Lucas answered automatically, his mind still far away. "Yes," he said, not really paying attention. "Mr. Ferraz, we have the reports ready. The merger with Nexus can be finalized today, but we need your approval before sending it to the lawyers. Send it to my email." "I'll review it later," he replied, short and direct, hanging up before the assistant could protest. He wasn't in the mood to discuss mergers at that moment. Lucas looked at his reflection in the glass in front of him. He saw himself sitting in his leather chair, the city as a backdrop, a living symbol of his own rise to the top, but he felt a deep disconnect with the image reflected back at him. It was as if something was missing, something he hadn't even realized he needed until that very moment. The woman's face came back to his mind, along with distant images from his childhood, memories he had long tried to bury. They started to surface slowly, as if triggered by something hidden. Against his will, Lucas found himself transported to a place he had sworn never to revisit. He was only 5 years old, sitting on a narrow bed with rough sheets, in a room shared with other children. The orphanage where he grew up wasn't a place of horrors, but it wasn't a home either. It was a place of transitions where no one bothered to form bonds, because the kids came and went like leaves in the wind. He remembered sleepless nights, listening to the wind beating against the dirty windows, and wondering why no one ever came for him. There was one image that had never left his mind, even after years of trying to suppress it. The day his mother left him at the orphanage. He was very young, but the memory of that goodbye was etched into his being, like an invisible scar. He remembered her hands, thin and trembling, holding him for the last time. She said something, but her voice felt so distant now, almost unrecognizable. After that, all he knew was that she walked away without looking back. Why was this hitting him now? He had always believed he'd moved past that part of his life. After all, his strength came precisely from the absence of ties. He built everything with his own hands, without needing anyone. But the encounter with the elderly woman had brought up feelings he thought were long dead, or at least dormant. He remembered something she had asked him. "Did you ever have a family?" That question bothered him because it touched on something he had always avoided. He never had a family. He never knew his parents, never knew why he was abandoned. He had always thought he didn't need those answers, that his success was proof he wasn't defined by his past. But now, for the first time in years, he was questioning whether that was really true. Lucas stood up abruptly, feeling the weight of something undefined pressing on his chest. He walked over to the window and looked out at the city below, but his eyes didn't see the cars or the people. He was somewhere else in another time. The memories came flooding back. The long days at the orphanage, the constant loneliness, the feeling of always waiting for something or someone that never came. He remembered how, when he was 9 or 10 years old, he decided he would never wait again. He decided that the only person he could rely on was himself. And that's when he started building the armor he still carried today, an armor of coldness, of relentless determination. Love and compassion were distractions, luxuries he couldn't afford. But now, something was forcing him to rethink that stance. He thought of the elderly woman, this stranger with tired, yet piercing eyes and words full of mystery. Who was she? Why had she found him? And why did her words stir up this uncomfortable feeling that there was something he needed to face, something he had long buried? He ran his hand through his hair, feeling the stress tightening around his head like a vice. The last time he allowed himself to think about his mother, he was still an angry teenager, with no answers and no one to ask. He had never looked into what had happened to her, never wanted to know. Part of him preferred to believe she simply didn't want him. It was easier to deal with anger than with the pain of uncertainty. Now, though, the idea that the past might be closer than he thought was starting to take shape in his mind, against his will. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, trying to push away the image of the woman. But she remained there, like a shadow. The feeling of familiarity, the way she had looked at him, Lucas couldn't shake the sense that she knew more about his story than he did. "Why did I never try to find out what happened to her?" he muttered to himself as he looked out at the hazy city skyline. His mind, however, already knew the answer. He never searched because the fear of discovering something unbearable had paralyzed him. And now, this question he had spent his life avoiding seemed like the only thing that could fill the emptiness that had always followed him, like a ghost. Lucas took a step back, away from the window. His reflection now seemed more vulnerable, almost unrecognizable. That cold, ruthless businessman had somehow been shaken by a simple conversation on the sidewalk with a woman he barely knew. He went back to his desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out a small wooden box he always kept there, like a talisman. Inside, there was a single old photo, already yellowed and worn by time. It was an image of a little boy about 2 years old, sitting on a swing in a park. He didn't remember that moment, but he knew it was his mother who had taken him there. That was the only thing he had left of her. And for a long time, he didn't want anything else. But now, for the first time in many years, Lucas felt like maybe it was time to change that. In the days that followed, Lucas's life appeared to continue as usual. He handled his responsibilities, made important decisions, negotiated million-dollar contracts, and kept up with his routine of meetings. But behind the flawless facade he prided himself on maintaining, something had shifted. The shadow of that unexpected encounter on the sidewalk seemed to follow him wherever he went. The old woman's face, her mysterious words, and above all, the discomfort she had stirred in him, remained vivid, like a wound refusing to heal. Lucas tried to push those thoughts away, just as he always did with anything that threatened his controlled routine. He threw himself into work, immersed himself in meetings and contracts, but nothing seemed to smother that unsettling feeling growing inside him. There was something about that woman, something in what she had said, that he just couldn't ignore. On the third night after the encounter, after another long day at the office, Lucas found himself in his penthouse, surrounded by the oppressive luxury that once felt comfortable. He was sitting in his leather armchair, a glass of wine beside him, but his thoughts were far away. He gazed at the brightly lit city below, the silence of the night broken only by the distant sound of traffic. His mind wandered back to the woman. Who was she really? How did she know so much about him? And why did her presence disturb him in a way he couldn't explain? Without realizing it, he began mentally replaying their conversation. Sometimes the past is what gives meaning to the present. That phrase echoed inside him, bringing up memories he had spent years burying. With each memory that surfaced, the emptiness he had always tried to ignore seemed to grow. It was as if, for the first time, he was being forced to face the reality he had always avoided, the past he had never wanted to confront. Deep down, Lucas knew there was something unresolved, something he needed to figure out. The image of the photo he kept in his desk came to mind, that single reminder of his childhood, a trace of a time he had chosen to forget. But now, he felt he could no longer run from it. The woman had planted a seed of doubt, and no matter how much he wanted to, he couldn't ignore it. That night he barely slept, and when morning came, he made a decision. It was a gray Thursday, the cloudy sky reflecting his gloomy mood. Lucas decided that, before heading to the office, he would walk down the same street where he had met the woman. He wasn't exactly sure what he was hoping to find, but something inside him pushed him to go back. Maybe it was just curiosity, or maybe it was a deeper need for answers. When he arrived at the busy street, the sound of people coming and going was muffled by the cold wind cutting through the morning. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the area, searching for any sign of the woman. The spot where she had been sitting seemed empty at first glance. Maybe she wasn't there today. Maybe she had disappeared as mysteriously as she had entered his life. But then he saw her, sitting in the same corner, hunched under the old, faded coat, her trembling hands clutching the same empty disposable coffee cup. Her face looked tired, wrinkled, her hair white and tangled. Everything about her seemed to reflect years of suffering, of a hard and forgotten life. But there was something else in her eyes, a depth that Lucas couldn't ignore. He took a deep breath and approached her, not really sure what to say or what he expected from this reunion. The very fact that he had come back bothered him. Lucas Ferraz, a man who never let anything distract him, was now being consumed by an irrational impulse, as if he was being pulled by an invisible force. "Good morning," he said, his voice sounding more hesitant than he would have liked. He handed her another coffee, just like he had the last time. The woman slowly lifted her gaze, her eyes meeting his. This time, there was a softness in her expression, as if she had been expecting him. "I knew you would come back," she said, taking the coffee with trembling hands. "Sometimes, we can't run away from what we need to face." Lucas frowned, feeling that familiar discomfort rising within him. I'm not exactly sure why I'm here," he admitted, sitting down on the curb beside her, just like before. "But it seems like you do." She didn't respond immediately. She took a sip of the coffee and looked out at the horizon, as if lost in distant thoughts. "There are many things people ignore in life," she said after a long silence. "Losses, regrets, the things we leave behind haunt us. Even when we try to forget them." Lucas felt a tightness in his chest. She spoke simply, but her words touched something deep inside him, something he didn't want to admit, but now seemed impossible to deny. He looked at her more closely, studying her worn features, and that strange feeling of familiarity washed over him again. There was something about the way she spoke, the way she looked at him, that felt so familiar. "Why do you say these things?" he asked, more sharply this time. "You don't even know me." The woman turned to him, her tired eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "I know you more than you think, Lucas. I know the pain you carry, the pain of not knowing where you came from, of feeling like something is missing, even when you have everything." He stayed silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of her words. His first reaction was to defend himself, to deny that there was any emptiness, to deny that he needed anything beyond the success he had built. But the truth was, at that moment, he couldn't hide behind his usual coldness. "I grew up not knowing who my parents were," he finally said, his voice low. "I never looked into it, never cared to know, because I thought it didn't matter. I thought I was better off alone." The woman nodded slowly, as if she already knew that. "The truth is, we often pretend we're fine, that we don't need answers. But the past, it always finds a way to catch up with us." Lucas felt a growing discomfort. He didn't like where this conversation was going, but something inside him kept him from getting up and leaving. He wanted answers, but he didn't even know what questions to ask. "What do you know about me?" he asked, staring directly at her. "You talk like you know who I am, like you know me. Why?" The woman looked deeply into his eyes, and the silence that followed was almost suffocating. For a moment, it seemed like she was about to reveal something, but then she looked away, as if the time wasn't right yet. "We're not always ready for the answers we seek," she finally said. "Sometimes, you need to forgive the past before you can face it." Lucas shook his head, confused and frustrated. "Forgive what? I don't understand what you're trying to say." She smiled softly, like a mother who knows something her child isn't ready to understand. "You will, Lucas. But first, you have to be ready for it." Before he could respond, she stood up slowly, her movements sluggish and pained. "I'll give you some time. When you're ready to hear the truth, you'll know where to find me." Lucas remained seated, watching her walk away. The cold wind blew down the street, but he barely felt it. His mind was racing, a storm of questions, memories, and confusion. Who was this woman? Why did she talk as if she knew everything about him? And why did it affect him so deeply? As much as he wanted to return to his normal life, focus on his responsibilities, and forget what had just happened, he knew that, from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. Lucas was already standing up, ready to put an end to this unsettling conversation. The woman's words, always full of riddles, were making him more impatient by the second. He wasn't used to losing control of a situation, and this interaction made him feel exactly that: out of control, restless, as if something inside him was being forcefully unearthed. The cold morning wind bit at his skin as he adjusted his jacket, preparing to leave. "I need to go," he muttered, trying to mask his discomfort with a firm tone. He had already given too much time to this incomprehensible situation, and his mind needed to get back to work, back to business. Control was all he knew, and this moment was slipping away from that in a way that irritated him. But as Lucas took the first step to walk away, he felt a soft touch on his arm. He stopped immediately and looked down. The woman's hand, fragile and trembling, gently held onto his sleeve in a way that felt more like a plea than a demand. Surprised, he pulled back slightly, but he didn't shake her off. "Wait," she said, her voice thick with emotion and somewhat urgent. She seemed to be struggling with something inside, as if she knew she wouldn't get another chance to do what she was about to do. "You need to see this," she continued, her eyes glistening, still holding him with the same delicate grip. Lucas looked at her with suspicion. Her words always carried an unbearable sense of mystery, and the last thing he wanted right now was another riddle. But before he could respond or free himself from her touch, the woman, with trembling fingers, pulled a small object from the worn-out pocket of her coat. It was a photo, crumpled and yellowed with age. She held it with painful reverence, as if that piece of paper was the key to something she had carried with her for years. "Please," the woman said, her voice now a whisper, almost breaking. "Look." Lucas hesitated, but reached out and took the photo. The paper felt rough, as if it had been handled countless times. He unfolded the picture slowly, not expecting much, maybe just to get it over with so he could leave. But when his eyes landed on the photograph, time seemed to stop. The picture showed a baby, no more than a few months old, lying in the lap of a young woman. The baby, he knew instantly, was him. There was no doubt. The big eyes, the innocent smile, the features he recognized from the few photos that remained of his childhood at the orphanage. But what caught his attention more than the recognition of himself was the woman holding the baby. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with dark brown hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. Her eyes were bright, but carried an indescribable sadness. Her face was partly shaded by the soft daylight, but Lucas could clearly see that she held the baby, him, with a tenderness that was almost tangible. It was such an intimate scene, so full of affection, that Lucas felt something twist inside him. His heart raced, and his mind became flooded with confusion. He looked at the woman in the photo, then at the elderly woman sitting in front of him, watching him with anticipation. The young woman in the picture had a calm expression, but at the same time, her face was marked by a melancholy that seemed to echo in the posture of the woman now handing him the photo. There was something unmistakable in the eyes of both women. The sense of familiarity that had haunted him since their first meeting now began to take shape in a way Lucas wasn't ready to accept. His eyes widened, and he was speechless for a few moments, just staring at the photo, then at the woman still sitting across from him. "Where did you get this?" he finally managed to ask, his voice full of disbelief. His throat was dry, and his hands, holding the photo, began to tremble slightly. The idea that this woman knew more about him than she was letting on felt more real, more unsettling. The woman lowered her head for a moment, as if preparing to reveal a truth she knew would be devastating. When she looked back up at him, her eyes were filled with a quiet pain. She hesitated before speaking, as though the words were difficult to say. "I've kept this photo for a long time," she began, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. I thought I'd never have the chance to show it to you." Lucas took a step back, trying to process what was happening. The air around him felt heavy, as if the world was about to collapse under the weight of an imminent revelation. He didn't know what to ask or even what to think. That photograph, the image of him as a baby in the arms of a woman who now resembled the beggar sitting before him, stirred something deep inside that he had spent his whole life avoiding. His past, his origins, everything he had buried along with the memories of his lonely childhood. "Why do you have this photo?" he asked, his voice steady but still filled with disbelief. The woman pressed her lips together, taking a deep breath before answering. "Because there are things you need to know, Lucas. Things you've never tried to understand. But they've always been there, waiting to be uncovered." Lucas shook his head, feeling the weight of confusion and anger growing inside him. "What do you want from me? Why are you showing me this now?" The photo was still in his hand, and he held it tightly, as if the paper might crumble if he let it go. She didn't respond immediately, her silence almost unbearable, as if the words weren't ready to come out yet. But then, she looked at him with such intensity that the air between them seemed heavier. "You deserve to know the truth," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But the truth, sometimes it's harder to accept than any lie we tell ourselves." Lucas felt his stomach twist. The truth. He'd always believed that the past didn't matter, that whatever had happened before his success had no bearing on the man he had become. And yet, here he was, facing a woman who knew more about his life than he did. And this woman, with her mysterious presence, had just unearthed something he wasn't ready to face. He didn't know what to think, much less what to do. Questions piled up in his mind, but the answers seemed to slip further away with each passing second. His heart raced, a mix of anger, fear, and uncertainty. I need to go," he said suddenly, turning and walking quickly away from the woman. This time, she didn't try to stop him. She just watched as he walked off, still gripping the photo tightly in his hand. Lucas walked as fast as he could, trying to outrun the avalanche of emotions that now threatened to overwhelm him. But no matter how hard he tried, the image of that photo, the woman, and her words kept echoing in his mind. "You deserve to know the truth." The morning chill followed Lucas as he walked quickly, almost desperately, trying to shake off what he had just uncovered. The photo was still in his hand, crumpled between his fingers, but he didn't dare look at it again. His mind was a storm of feelings and memories fighting to surface, like a violent tide threatening to pull him under. Each step he took felt heavy, as if the world around him was trying to drag him back to that sidewalk, to that moment. But he couldn't run away. Finally, he stopped at the corner. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, were now filled with tears, and his breathing was quick, almost gasping. The sounds of people around him, cars passing by, and distant voices were drowned out by the storm in his head. He looked at the photo in his hand, feeling the weight of that image. The baby he once was, the woman holding him, and the overwhelming thought that the elderly woman sitting on the sidewalk could be his mother. "It can't be," he murmured to himself. But the more he tried to reject the idea, the stronger it became. The young woman's eyes in the photo, her features, everything connected to that old, frail figure he had just encountered. A shiver ran down his spine. It was impossible to deny what he didn't want to accept. With clenched fists, Lucas turned on his heels and headed back. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say, but he knew he couldn't leave without answers, without an explanation. There was a mix of anger, pain, and a strange sense of hope he couldn't quite define. He needed to understand. He needed to hear the truth, no matter how painful it might be. As he approached the spot where the woman had been, he saw her just as he'd left her, sitting in the same corner, shoulders slumped, hands clasped on her lap, as if she had been waiting for him to return. She slowly raised her eyes as she saw him come back. There was no surprise in her gaze, just a deep sadness, a quiet acknowledgement of the moment that was about to unfold. Lucas stopped in front of her, his body tense, his eyes locked on her. The wind blew between them, cold and sharp, but nothing in that moment could cool the heat of the confrontation that was about to happen. "I want an explanation," he said, his voice steadier than he felt inside. "I demand that you tell me what's going on." The woman watched him for a long moment. Her eyes glistening with tears, she seemed to be struggling to hold back. She knew this moment would come. She knew she couldn't run anymore. "You're right," she began, her voice low and hoarse. "You deserve to know the truth. All of this should have been told to you a long time ago." Lucas felt his stomach tighten, as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for her to push him over. He didn't reply, just stared at her, waiting, almost dreading what she would say next. She took a deep breath and, with a trembling voice, began to speak. "I am your mother, Lucas." The words hit Lucas like a punch straight to the chest, even though he had been expecting them. Hearing it out loud, with so much emotional weight, made everything around him fade away for a moment. He closed his eyes for a second, trying to control the flood of emotions that followed. I'm the woman who left you at the orphanage when you were just a baby," she continued, her voice cracking. "I was young, married to a terrible man. Your father. He was violent, dangerous. I knew that if I stayed with him, you'd be dragged into that life, too." She paused, her voice faltering as she remembered the past. I tried to protect you for as long as I could, but there came a point when I had no other choice. The only thing I could do was leave you somewhere you could be safe away from all of that." Lucas felt his chest tighten even more. Her words were beginning to make sense, but that only made the pain worse. She went on, tears now streaming freely down her wrinkled face. "I never wanted to abandon you, Lucas. Never. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving you, but it was the only way I knew to make sure you wouldn't end up like him. I left, and you stayed at the orphanage, where I knew you'd have a chance to be saved from that life." Lucas shook his head, feeling the anger rising in his chest. "So you left me there?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief and bitterness. "You just abandoned me and moved on with your life?" "I never moved on," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I spent every day, every year, looking for you. I tried to find you so many times, but you had been adopted, and I couldn't track you down anymore. It was like the world had swallowed you up, and I never found you again." Lucas took a step back, the pain and anger exploding inside him. "So, while I was growing up in that orphanage alone, feeling abandoned by someone who never cared about me, you were looking for me?" The words came out dripping with sarcasm and pain. "Do you think that makes any difference now?" The woman started to cry openly, her trembling hands going to her face as she tried to speak. I know I can't fix the past. I know I hurt you in a way that might never be forgiven. But please understand, I did it to protect you. I didn't have another choice." "Protect me?" Lucas repeated, his voice rising. "You left me in a place where I didn't know anyone. I grew up thinking I meant nothing to anyone. And now you show up, after all these years, saying you did it for me? That it was the best thing for me." The woman sobbed, trying to pull herself together. "I know it seems impossible to understand right now, but I loved you. I always loved you. And every day away from you was torture, something I can't even describe." Lucas felt the tears burning in his eyes, but he held them back, not wanting to show weakness. "You abandoned me," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You left me alone. How do you think I'm supposed to understand that? How do you think I'm supposed to forgive you?" The weight of his words hung between them, and the woman shrank under the burden of guilt. She knew she deserved his anger, the pain he was expressing. Her shoulders shook as tears continued to fall, but she had nothing left to say, nothing that could ease his pain in that moment. Lucas, with a broken heart and a mind in turmoil, turned abruptly, the tears finally breaking through the barrier he had tried so hard to keep up. He didn't look back as he walked away quickly, his steps hurried and confused. Her voice followed him, shattered by her crying. "I'm so sorry, Lucas. Please forgive me." But Lucas didn't stop. He walked aimlessly, his face what with the tears he could no longer hold back, her words echoing in his mind. The pain, the anger, the abandonment, it all swirled together in an overwhelming storm of emotions. And in his heart, the emptiness he had always felt seemed now deeper than ever before. Back in his towering penthouse, Lucas slammed the door shut, the sound reverberating off the glass and steel walls. The apartment was wrapped in an oppressive silence, the only sound being his heavy breathing. The luxury around him, modern furniture, expensive artwork, the panoramic view of the city. None of it felt real in that moment. Everything that once symbolized his success, his strength, his independence, now seemed empty, like a mask he no longer knew how to wear. He walked toward the large floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city below. The lights sparkled like stars, but what used to give him a sense of control and power now felt distant and meaningless. The weight of the revelation he'd received that day was unbearable. He pressed his hands against the cold glass, his mind swirling with thoughts he couldn't quiet. Your mother, that woman, the one he spent his whole life imagining but never really searching for. He remembered the few times he allowed himself to think about her when he was a child, during those lonely nights at the orphanage, wondering what it would be like if she had been with him. But he always dismissed those fantasies as useless. She had abandoned him, and he believed that this defined him. His strength, his coldness. Everything was built on that absence, on that emptiness. Now everything felt so confusing. She hadn't left him out of indifference, as he had always believed. She left to protect him, or at least that's what she said. But how could he accept that? How could he accept that all the years of loneliness, anger, and resentment were the result of a choice she made for his own good? Lucas squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the thoughts, but they came with overwhelming intensity. He sank into the leather couch, eyes fixed on the ceiling as his mind replayed, against his will, every detail of that day's encounter. The woman's face, her silent tears, the way she had held the photo so carefully, it consumed him. He tried to convince himself that he didn't need this. He had lived his entire life without her. Everything he had built, every triumph and victory, he had achieved on his own. And, in a way, he took pride in that solitude, in that emotional isolation that made him seem invulnerable. Never depending on anyone had been his greatest strength. But now, knowing that she had spent all these years trying to find him, trying to make things right, it gnawed at him. He couldn't simply ignore it. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of the crumpled photo still in his pocket. Him and her, together, before life tore them apart. Lucas rubbed his face with his hands, the weight of emotional exhaustion pressing down on him. He tried to imagine what his life would have been like if she hadn't left. And, for the first time, he allowed himself to think about the what-if, something he had always avoided. What if she had stayed? What if she had raised him? What if he hadn't grown up in the orphanage, alone, knowing nothing about where he came from? What would his life have been like? Who would he have become? These questions hurt. He had always believed that his success was a direct result of his resilience, of the strength he had developed from being abandoned. But what if he was wrong? What if his life could have been different? Happier? Less lonely? Maybe he wouldn't have built that impenetrable emotional fortress, that mask of coldness. Maybe he would have known what it felt like to be loved from the start. And if what she said was true, that his father was a violent man, that she left to protect him, then she really had tried to save him. But that didn't erase the years of loneliness, the days without answers. Lucas felt a dull anger rise inside him. How could she have made that decision for him? How could she have just disappeared and let him believe he meant nothing? He ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. The dilemma between hatred and compassion was eating him up. Part of Lucas wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that she did what she thought was right. But another part just couldn't forgive. He was still that abandoned boy who had learned early on that he couldn't trust anyone but himself. Flashes of his childhood started to resurface. The sleepless nights at the orphanage, hearing the other kids cry for parents who, in the end, would come back to take them home. But he never cried. There came a point when the kids at the orphanage realized that no one was coming for them. He had learned that early, and it was what made him close off his heart. And now, this woman who suddenly appeared, did she really expect to be forgiven for that? Lucas stood up abruptly and began pacing around the apartment, anger growing with every step. He tried, in vain, to stifle the storm of emotions inside him. But with every step, every lap around the room, the confrontation replayed in his mind. Her tears, his own pain exploding in shouts, and the way he left her behind. His thoughts came and went like waves. Sometimes he wanted to go back, confront her again, ask more questions, demand answers she might not have given yet. Other times, he just wanted to disappear, never see her again. Forget. Pretend it never happened. The night dragged on slowly. As the early hours of the morning crept in, Lucas still couldn't sleep. The silence of the apartment felt suffocating, and every time he tried to close his eyes, her face would come back to his mind, along with the image of him in her arms, in that old photograph. He had spent so long not knowing anything about her, not even allowing himself to imagine his mother, that now reality was hitting him hard. Deep down, Lucas knew he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Something inside him had changed irreversibly. He had tried to suppress these feelings for years, but her presence, the sound of her voice, her tears, had awakened something he didn't know how to control. The image of his young mother, holding him in her arms, was living proof that there was a past he had never explored. And now, he had to face it. The night slowly turned into morning, and as the pale sunlight filtered through the windows, Lucas felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The decision ahead of him weighed more heavily than ever. The dilemma between forgiveness and anger consumed him. He knew he had to decide, but for the first time in a long time, Lucas felt like he wasn't in control anymore. The emptiness that had followed him throughout his life was still there, but now it was filled with questions. Questions that only she could answer. He felt that the only way forward was to confront the past and somehow face what he feared more than anything, the possibility of forgiveness. The next morning brought a cloudy, heavy sky, reflecting Lucas's state of mind. He had barely slept, and his thoughts were restless, as if every emotion and thought were fighting for space in his mind. The previous night had been a battle between the desire to bury the past and the urge to understand the truth. But Lucas knew that, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't keep ignoring what was now right in front of him. The encounter with the woman, his mother, as she had claimed, had broken something inside him, something he had carefully guarded for years. Desperate for answers, Lucas got in his car and drove aimlessly through the city streets. His mind wandered, lost in a swirl of confused memories and conflicting feelings. Then, almost without realizing it, his thoughts led him back to a place he hadn't visited in many years. The church. It was an old building located in a quieter part of town. Lucas used to go there when he was younger, right after leaving the orphanage during the first few years when he was struggling to find his footing. Back then, he felt lost, adrift without direction. Father Jose, the priest in charge of the parish, had been one of the few people Lucas had allowed to get close to him. In a way, the priest had been like a father figure, offering advice when Lucas needed it most. Now, years later, he wasn't sure why he was going back there. Maybe it was the desperation for some kind of guidance, something that could help him make the decision that was tormenting him. The dilemma of whether to forgive his mother or remain trapped in his anger was eating away at his heart. And for the first time in a long time, Lucas felt incapable of solving something on his own. He parked the car in front of the church. The gray stone walls and the stained glass windows welcomed him like an old acquaintance. The last time he'd been here, he was still a young, ambitious man, starting his climb toward success. He had left spirituality behind, replacing faith with a relentless pursuit of control and power. But now, none of that seemed to matter. What once brought him security, his wealth, his status, was no longer enough to fill the emptiness he felt. Lucas crossed the small square in front of the church, and the memories hit him hard. The bell, which rang every morning, was the same. The faint scent of burning candles inside was familiar. As he entered, the calm atmosphere wrapped around him, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside. The smell of old wood, the soft echo of footsteps on the stone floor, the reverent silence. It all seemed frozen in time, as if nothing had changed since his last visit. Father Jose was sitting on one of the benches, silent, gazing at the altar ahead. He didn't seem to have aged much, though his hair was more gray and his movements a little slower. The priest had a calm and solid presence, a serenity that always reassured Lucas, even during the most turbulent moments of his youth. When Lucas approached, the priest turned and smiled, his eyes full of understanding even before Lucas said a word. "Lucas Ferraz," he said, his voice deep and kind. "It's been a long time. I wasn't expecting to see you here." Lucas stopped a few steps away, unsure of how to begin. The last time he had been there, he felt so different, full of dreams and ambition. Now, all he felt was confusion and pain. He took a deep breath, searching for the right words, but they seemed to elude him. "Father, I don't know what to do anymore." His voice, usually steady and confident, now sounded vulnerable. I met someone who told me things about my past, things I never wanted to know, and now I don't know how to deal with it." Father Jose listened calmly, his eyes attentive, without interrupting. He knew Lucas needed space to share his feelings, something he had always been hesitant to do. Finally, the priest spoke, his voice soft but serious. "Sit down, my son. Let's talk." Lucas sat next to the priest, and without needing much encouragement, he began to open up. He talked about meeting the woman, about the photo, and about the shocking revelation that she was his mother. He explained how he had spent his life believing he was abandoned and had never wanted to know more about his parents. And now, discovering that his mother had been looking for him all these years, threw all his certainties about himself into disarray. As he spoke, the anger and sadness he had been holding back began to surface. "She left me, Father. She just left me in an orphanage. And now, after all these years, she shows up like I should forgive her, like everything can just be fixed." Father Jose listened in silence, but his eyes reflected empathy and compassion. When Lucas finished, feeling exhausted from the outpouring of emotions, the priest remained quiet for a few moments, thinking. Finally, he began to speak. "Lucas, forgiveness isn't an easy decision, especially when the pain runs as deep as yours. But forgiveness isn't just about the person who hurt you. It's also about you. Holding on to anger, resentment, those things weigh down your soul. and I know your soul has been carrying a heavy burden for a long time." Lucas lowered his head, fighting the urge to deny. He had always believed that his strength came from his ability to keep his pain inside and move forward alone. But in that moment, standing there with the priest, he could no longer maintain that facade. "What she did was wrong," the priest continued, "but it wasn't out of indifference. From what you've told me, it came from fear and a need to protect. No one can go back and fix the past, but you can choose how you'll live with it." Lucas felt a lump forming in his throat. Part of him knew the priest was right, but another part still refused to accept it. "I don't know if I can forgive her, Father. I'm still so angry. Everything I am was built on the idea that I was alone. And now I don't know what to think anymore." Father Jose nodded. "Forgiveness isn't something that happens all at once, Lucas. It's a process, and it's normal to feel angry. But think about this. Love, even when hurt, doesn't just disappear. Maybe her love for you was imperfect, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there. And sometimes forgiving someone isn't about justifying what happened, but about freeing yourself from the weight you've been carrying." The silence between them grew, heavy but filled with understanding. Lucas thought about the priest's words, feeling a mix of relief and resistance. Part of him wanted to believe that forgiveness was possible, that facing his mother again could bring some kind of healing. But another part still fought against it, clinging to the anger that had defined him for so long. "I don't know if I can do this," Lucas said, his voice weak, almost a whisper. Father Jose smiled gently, placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You'll figure out what's right, Lucas. You've always had that strength within you. The most important thing to remember is that forgiveness isn't about erasing the pain, but giving yourself the chance to move forward without being chained to the past." Lucas nodded, feeling the weight of the priest's words settle in his heart. He didn't have all the answers yet. He didn't know if he was ready to forgive. But as he left the church, with the morning sun breaking through the clouds, he knew he couldn't keep running. The emptiness inside him wouldn't go away until he faced his mother again, until he found a way to confront the past and maybe, just maybe, make room for something new. With a heavy but determined heart, Lucas moved forward to the next step of his journey. He didn't know what that reunion would look like, but he was determined not to let the past keep controlling his life. The next day, the sky was clearer, but the weight on Lucas' heart remained the same. Father Jose's words echoed in his mind, like a constant breeze he couldn't shake off. Forgiveness isn't about justifying what happened, but about freeing yourself. He knew the priest's advice held a deep truth, but accepting it wasn't simple. Everything he had built his whole life had been based on the belief that he was on his own, that he didn't need anyone, especially not someone who had abandoned him. And yet, something inside him had changed since he saw his mother, sitting on that sidewalk, offering him explanations and tears he never expected to receive. The truth was that, no matter how much anger tried to take over his thoughts, there was a bigger conflict in his heart. He wanted to understand. He wanted answers, not just for what happened, but for himself. The emptiness that had followed him for so long, and that he had always filled with work, success, and status, now felt deeper. Maybe forgiveness was the only way to overcome it. Lucas wasn't sure what to expect when he saw her again, but that morning, he made the decision he had been putting off. He would go back to see her, and this time, not just to accuse her or unload his anger. He was going to listen. Forgiveness, if it came, wouldn't be easy, but Father Jose was right about one thing. Forgiveness is a process, and this would be the first step. He drove in silence to the place where he had first found her, the streets of the city passing by like shadows. His mind was focused on the task ahead, and the doubts that usually tormented him seemed far away. When he finally parked, his heart raced. There was something final about this visit, something he knew would change his life, one way or another. As he got out of the car, Lucas saw the fragile figure of the woman in the distance. She was in the same spot, sitting on the sidewalk, her shoulders hunched and her hands resting on her lap. She didn't notice him immediately, and Lucas felt a sudden hesitation. Part of him wanted to turn back, to run away from the emotional chaos this meeting would inevitably bring. But he took a deep breath and walked toward her. As he got closer, the woman finally lifted her head. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Lucas saw the weariness on her face, the suffering of a hard life, but also something else, a glimpse of hope. It was as if she already knew why he had come back. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in front of her, watching her in silence. The woman remained quiet too, as if afraid to break the fragile balance between them. Lucas then took a deep breath and sat down next to her, just as he had the first time. The coldness of the ground brought with it a strange feeling of connection to reality, as if he was getting ready to dive into something inevitable. After a few minutes of silence, he finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "I want to understand." The woman looked at him, surprised, as if those words were more than she had expected. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she held them back. She seemed to know this moment was delicate, something that needed to be handled with care. "I thought I'd never see you again," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I thought you would never forgive me, that you would never give me a chance to explain." "I don't know if I can forgive you," Lucas replied, his voice deep and sincere. "But I need to know. I need to understand why you did what you did." She nodded slowly, taking a deep breath before she began. "I've already told you part of the story, Lucas, but I think you deserve to know everything." Lucas looked down at the floor, bracing himself for what she was about to say. "When I met your father, I was very young. Foolish, maybe," she started, her voice cracking as she recalled the past. "I fell in love with him blindly, without seeing the signs that he was a violent man. At first, he seemed charismatic, passionate, but that changed quickly. He became a dangerous man, controlling every aspect of my life. When you were born, I knew things would only get worse. He was unpredictable, and I feared for your safety." She paused, wiping away the tears that had started to fall down her face. "I knew he could hurt you, that the violence he unleashed on me would one day turn on you too. I wanted to run, but I had nowhere to go. And then, when things became unbearable, I made the only decision I thought could save you. I left you at the orphanage, Lucas, because I knew you would be safe there, far away from him. I couldn't protect you on my own." Lucas listened in silence, his heart heavy. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with a deep sadness that he could barely express. He knew, deep down, that the decision had also destroyed her. "I looked for you for so long," she continued, her voice shaky. "When I finally managed to escape him, I came back to get you, but you weren't there anymore. They told me you had been adopted, and after that, I lost all traces of where you were. I spent years searching for you, trying to find you, but it was as if the world had swallowed you whole." She looked at him, her eyes pleading for understanding. "Lucas, I know what I did caused you pain, a pain you might never be able to get over. But please believe that, deep down, I did what I thought was the only way to save you." The silence that followed was unbearable. Lucas felt a mix of emotions he could barely name. Part of him wanted to hug that woman, his mother, and tell her everything was okay, that he forgave her. But another part still carried the weight of the hurt, the lonely childhood, the sleepless nights wondering why he had been abandoned. "I spent my whole life thinking you left me because I didn't matter," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I convinced myself I was alone in the world because it was easier than believing there might be a reason. But now I don't know what to think." The woman reached out hesitantly, but didn't touch him, as if waiting for his permission. "Lucas, I've loved you every day of my life. I just wanted a chance to tell you that. I know I made mistakes. I know I failed you, but I never stopped loving you." Her words were like a soft blow, but deep. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, fighting back tears. He knew forgiveness wouldn't come right away, but he also knew that continuing to deny this truth, the love she had never stopped feeling, would be lying to himself. After a long silence, he finally opened his eyes and looked at her. There was a sea of emotions in his chest, but he knew that, somehow, he had to take a step toward healing. "I don't know if I can forgive everything." "Not yet," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "But I'm willing to try." Lucas' mother looked at him with a mix of relief and emotion, tears finally flowing freely from her eyes. Lucas, still with a heavy heart, gave a small nod, as if he were opening a door to something he didn't know where it would lead. They stayed there side by side in silence. There was no need for more words at that moment. Lucas still felt the weight of the pain and hurt, but for the first time, there was room for something else, a possibility of healing, of understanding. Maybe with time, full forgiveness would come. Maybe not. But the first step had been taken. The days that followed Lucas' reunion with his mother were a mix of emotional tension and a strange sense of relief. It wasn't complete relief, like all the problems had magically been solved, but more of an uncomfortable peace. The awareness that the first step had been taken, that the path to healing, though long and uncertain, was now open. Lucas spent much of that time reflecting on everything he had heard. The nights were still tough. He would often stay up late, his thoughts running wild while the silence of his luxurious apartment seemed to echo the unanswered questions that remained. Who would he have been if his mother had stayed? Would his life have been different? Less lonely? These questions would never leave him completely, but now there was something new on the horizon, a chance to leave the past behind and build something different. The anger didn't fade away all at once. It was a slow process, and Lucas knew it would take time. He was still wrestling with the memories of his lonely childhood, but at the same time, he was beginning to allow himself to consider that his mother's love, however imperfect, had always been there. The pain of being abandoned was still present, but the guilt she carried and the sincerity with which she had begged for a second chance made him lower his defenses, even if only partially. One day, Lucas met her again in the same place, as if it had become an unspoken ritual. This time, he approached with less emotional urgency. There was a quiet calm between them, as if both knew that the next steps would require patience. He sat down beside her, and the silence they shared no longer felt as heavy as before. "I want to help you," Lucas said, breaking the silence. He looked at his mother seriously, but with a gentleness he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. "You don't have to keep living like this on the streets. I can take care of you." She looked at him, her eyes filling with tears once again. It was something she hadn't expected. After everything, the offer of care felt like a miracle, something she didn't dare dream of. "I don't know what to say," she replied, her voice weak but full of emotion. "I don't deserve this, Lucas." "Maybe it's not about what you deserve," he said after a moment. "Maybe it's about what I need to do." Lucas's voice was calm but firm. He knew that to move forward, he had to do something that until recently would have been unthinkable. He needed to make space for her in his life. The past couldn't be erased, but the future was still ahead of them, and he felt that he couldn't continue living with the coldness that had always guided him. There was a new vulnerability, something he was only beginning to explore. In the following weeks, Lucas made arrangements for his mother to leave the streets. He set up a simple apartment for her, close to his, and made sure she had medical care. At first, she resisted, but Lucas's persistence eventually won out. He knew that he couldn't fix emotional wounds with material gestures alone, But he believed this was the first step, an attempt to restore some of the dignity that life on the streets had taken from her. The transition wasn't easy for either of them. For Lucas, it felt strange to have this presence in his life, something he had denied for so many years. Their conversations were cautious, almost formal at first, as if they were testing the boundaries of what they could say and do. She, on the other hand, seemed to slowly recover from the weight of the years she had spent wandering, searching for a son she never thought she'd find again. The fear of rejection still hung over her, but each day, as Lucas opened up a little more, she felt like this was the beginning of something that might one day be called forgiveness. One afternoon, Lucas invited her to go to a cafe. It wasn't a formal occasion, nor was it weighed down by heavy words like their previous meetings. It was something simple. The two of them sat side by side at a table near the window, watching the city bustling outside. It was the first time in a long while that Lucas had allowed himself to do something so ordinary with another person. He was used to the solitude of expensive dinners at fancy restaurants, but this company, as quiet as it was, brought him a strange sense of peace. "This place reminds me of something," she said, looking around. Her trembling fingers gently held the coffee cup. Lucas glanced at her, curious. "What does it remind you of?" She sighed, a soft smile on her lips. "Before everything fell apart with your father, we used to have coffee at places like this. It was one of the few things that brought us together. It was simple, without the violence, without the fear." Lucas remained silent, letting her words sink in. An image of his mother, young and full of hope, formed in his mind, and he compared it to the woman sitting in front of him now. Time had been cruel to both of them, but in that moment, they had returned to something simple, something that perhaps didn't need painful memories or explanations. The silence between them became more comfortable as time passed. Their conversations flowed better, and little by little, Lucas began to see his mother not just as a ghost from his past, someone he had avoided for so long, but as a real person with her own flaws and regrets. She, in turn, started to understand that forgiveness, if it came, would be gradual, but Lucas no longer seemed like the distant man he had been when they first met. There was something softer in his gestures, a warmth, timid but genuine. Slowly, they rebuilt what time had torn apart. There was no rush, and neither of them expected miracles. Lucas was still a man shaped by the loneliness of his childhood, and she still carried the scars of her choices. But for the first time, there was hope. There was room for something new. On one of the calmer days they shared, while walking quietly down the street, Lucas stopped and looked at her, feeling something inside him, frozen until now, begin to melt. He reached out his hand, hesitantly, and she, surprised, took it, her eyes filled with emotion. "And now?" she asked, uncertain of what the future held for them. Lucas looked at her for a moment, feeling the weight of what was coming, but this time without the paralyzing fear that had been with him for so long. "Now," he said with a small smile, "let's try to be a family." The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Lucas felt like he didn't have to walk it alone. The emptiness that had followed him for so many years was starting to be filled. Not with the material success he had once chased, but with something much simpler and yet infinitely more valuable. A human connection, a love that had survived, even though weakened by time. And so, hand in hand, mother and son walked together toward the future, one step at a time. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will move you as well. Click to keep watching.